Welcome to Voice with Vielka, the podcast dedicated to the ongoing quest for finding how to best teach kids to sing with confidence. I'm your host, Vielka, and I'll share my experiences as a performer, educator, founder, and mother for the last 20 years here in the heart of New York City. Thank you for joining me as I share with you the amazing people, practices, and talking points to help us grow together as singers, educators, entrepreneurs, and human beings. Hello, I am so excited to be here today with somebody who really appealed to me and caught my attention because not only is she a singer and a voice specialist, but she also has this tremendous background with therapy. And the blend of all these different aspects of the psychology and then the psychology of being a singer definitely plays into what I've been thinking about this year, which is the singer's mindset. I'm Vielka, this is Voice with Vielka podcast, and I'm honored to have with us here today Petra. And Petra, you'll have to help me. I forgot to ask you how to pronounce your last name. I'm going to take a shot and say Borzynski. How'd I do?
Yes, very good.
Yes, nailed it. Okay, she's going to tell us about her name and so much more, but just a little introduction about her and her work. Petra is a vocal, somatic, and cognitive behavioral coach, and she's an accredited therapist with special expertise in helping performing artists and creatives to perform better and despite their fears. She currently runs a busy private studio and practice. She's one of the solo performance specialists for voice for the University of the Highlands and Islands, and also regularly works with corporate clients like Google, helping performers and speakers all over the world sustain a singing career and find professional and personal fulfillment. Petra's work in the field of singing, creativity, performance anxiety, performance psychology, and mental health for performing artists has been featured at conferences and several publications and podcasts. One of her main areas of expertise is the education of other voice professionals in mental health and trauma awareness in their studios, organizations, and institutions. Petra's vision is access to continuous mental health support for every performer, and that looking after our mental and emotional health becomes preventative instead of curative. Yes. Oh, I'm so in love with your mission and just already just oozing glowingness thinking about what it is you do and bring to the world. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So I just wanted to start out asking you about your personal story. You know, where are you from? Where'd you grow up? And what sort of began your journey into where you are now?
Well, I was born in Germany. I'm German, actually, so you can still hear it in the accent, I think, although I'm living in Scotland now, so it's a very hybrid accent you get from me. So people always try to place me and try to figure out where I'm actually from. And I basically started out as probably many kids. I actually started playing instruments first. So my first love was actually the violin, and for a very long time I was actually undecided whether to sing or to play the violin sort of professionally, and singing eventually won over. So I sort of got into singing at school, basically. So I had a really great music teacher who sort of saw something or heard something in my voice that I didn't know was there, and that's from where it took off, essentially. And then I was deliberating to study voice, violin, and I didn't feel very confident in myself. And I also felt like I didn't have a lot of support at home. My parents were supportive, obviously, but when they heard studying music, it was a bit like, ooh, starving artist, that type of thing. And I think they had different things in mind for me. And because I wasn't very confident at the time, anyway, I sort of thought like, okay, I need to have something in the background that will provide me with a stable income and so on and so forth. So I basically triple majored in geoscience and music and theater studies. And that at least gave me the opportunity to still keep working on my voice and my instruments and so on and so forth. But I also felt there was something more tangible in the background somewhere, which is obviously total rubbish, as we all know. But I think if you're a teenager and you're deciding what you want to do with your life, I think looking back on it, sometimes we really didn't have much of a plan, to be totally honest. So yeah, that's how I got into music, essentially. And then it just developed from there.
Wow, that's
So
amazing. I'm trying to imagine your triple major. I mean, just being for those of you listening who were a performance major, just doing the one performance major was so much work. So I'm trying to imagine what that was like to not double but triple. Tell us a little bit more about how you juggled, and was that the beginning for you of when you started to make some maybe cross, you know, take elements of these different areas that you were studying and it started to kind of create the beginning of this world that you're now in?
yes, I think so. I think my love for science and always wanting to go to the roots of things, that definitely originated in geoscience, I think, and it helps as well. It sort of informs everything you do. So your sort of your whole outlook on stuff is a tiny bit different, I think. So it's not just music, although I don't want to say just music, if you know what I mean, but it's definitely it's something else. So I definitely felt that was a big influence. But I also have to admit that the main reason for that for a long time was actually confidence. So I can't really say that I yeah always had this massive urge to become a geoscientist or something like that. So that it was sort of the lesser evil for me. It was something I was interested in, and I sort of was interested in environmental science and environmental health, and I think that's how that came about. But it was stressful, so to sort of have like three subjects going at the same time. Looking back on it today, I'm thinking like, what was I even thinking? But it somehow worked out, so it was all good. And looking back on it, I probably also wouldn't want to change it because at the end of the day, it made me who I am today. So, but it was a tough time studying wise, definitely.
So then tell us, what happened from there? How did you get from, you have these multiple areas of study, and then at what point what was the next step for you after that?
The next step for me was yeah, complicated life story. Um, I sort of already, while I was studying, I already had my first engagements and I was singing and so on and so forth. And I thought everything was starting to fall into place. But then there was a sort of a bit of a family background, which I won't go into too deeply. But my mother was quite sick on and off. And so at the time, I felt just like it was better for me to do something to also be able to support her in a way and to not be so uprooted all the time. So I worked in environmental science for a short while. And then once everything, the waves sort of smoothed out a tiny bit and so on and so forth, that's when I went back into singing. So it wasn't immediate after finishing university that everything fell into place and there was the performance career and so on and so forth. I changed paths a tiny bit because my singing background was very classical to start with, and that was never my first love. But I'm a child of the 80s and 90s, so at the time, if you studied voice, it was basically it was jazz voice or classical voice, and that was the options you had. And jazz wasn't really my thing at the time, and so I studied classical voice. And I then switched and went back to study music theater performance, essentially. And that's where I ended up. And
Um,
everything fell into place there. And after it had fallen into place, I noticed that I didn't want it anymore.
oh my
And that
God.
performing was actually not really for me. So it's funny sometimes how things like that turn out when you feel like, oh yeah, the thing that you always imagine, this is what I really want to do. And then if you are actually doing it, you feel like maybe not.
Well, I want to pause and just highlight a couple things here because it's a trend that I've noticed in talking with a lot of singers. One is that, um, yeah, I don't know how much the scene has changed, although obviously it has changed a lot since then. But like you, same was true for me that if you wanted to study voice as a major at a university, really classical was the main degree and only degree. There was really like one road. The fact that there was classical and jazz was probably out there, but I wasn't even aware. So at least you had two roads as options. But it sounds like really Broadway musical theater was what was calling to you. And then the second part that I found interesting is that once you had it, you're like, no, this actually isn't for me, which also seems to be a common trend of like once you're in it and you're performing and you're living the lifestyle. So, at what point did you figure out, what was it where you're like, this, it's close, I like doing this, but no, this is not what I want to really be doing?
I think the thing for me was that I always enjoyed performing and I enjoyed the music as well and so on and so forth. But it was mainly sort of the lifestyle that I found tricky to handle and just sort of like, yeah, constantly auditioning and so on and so forth. So that was something I struggled with. And what I also struggled with on and off throughout my life was actually performance anxiety. And I was always quite good at hiding it. So I wasn't someone who like fell completely apart or something. So I was more sort of like standing in the wings nervously and so on and so forth. And I was buzzing just before going on. And then when I was on, I was actually okay. So I had more massive problems with sort of ruminating afterwards. So that was a big problem for me. So when I sort of started to pull apart what went wrong, what I didn't like, what I didn't do perfectly, and so on and so forth. So and that started to turn into something that I found really uncomfortable and distressing at some point, and where I just felt like this is really not you don't want to be like this for the rest of your life. So the option would have obviously been to do something about that, but again, the times weren't like they are now. I mean, we still have some way to go, I guess, but I think there's a lot more support now for performers with anxiety or any other mental health issue really than there was at the time. So at the time you just didn't talk about it really, or maybe with your best friends and colleagues sort of like behind closed doors or something, but it wasn't something that you were very open about, and there wasn't also a lot of support. So for me at some point the decision just was like, this is something I can't imagine doing for the rest of my life. So it was both a lifestyle but also how it made me feel constantly. And it was just a decision for me to say like, this is not what I want. And yeah, that was it essentially.
Yes, well, I can definitely relate. I mean, the lifestyle is very challenging. There's so much uncertainty and so many other aspects to it. And then this bit about the anxiety and just all the challenges with confidence. And I love how you were talking about the picking apart of the performance afterwards, because I think a lot of times when we talk about performance anxiety, we think of it in the context of, your heart is beating fast, your palms are sweating, you're about to go on stage, and how do you get through the performance? And I hear less talk about what you brought up about afterwards and how we then are very critical and we're replaying these moments and thinking, well, I could have done this or that, and how that can weigh on us, maybe even more than the initial just going onto stage and getting past that. So I'm dying to know, how you got into therapy and then actually ended up being one of the provider of tools. I mean, it's so beautiful to think about, so many people who went through what you went through and that you actually did go out and make change and are helping so many others with it. So tell us about that path into that side of things.
Well, I think it's just true what they say. I mean, you become the change you want to see. So I think for me, it was like I felt the support was really lacking. So I would imagine that initially there was a tiny bit of selfishness involved. So I wanted to understand myself better. And this is where the whole interest in psychology obviously came from. But also when I moved to Scotland, so when I gave up my performance career, I moved to Scotland afterwards, and I mainly focused on teaching from then onwards because I knew this is something I wanted to do essentially. And I think there was also because I saw what I saw in myself also in so many of my clients essentially. And I just felt like at some point, well, I don't just want to play by ear. I don't just want to go by my experience because although I had that experience as well, and maybe I had a feeling for how to potentially help and so on and so forth, I also felt like that we can't really operate like that. We can't really assume that everyone experiences nerves or anxiety or whatever it might be the way we do. So there was a wish to help more. And yeah, this is basically, I started off actually with a sort of life coach qualification first. And they actually worked in tandem with the University of the West of Scotland, who provides a psychology degree. And that's how I got into it and how I got more interested, because I sort of did a couple of courses from the actual psychology degree initially for the life coaching qualification. And then I thought, like, this is actually what I want to do. And that's how psychology came to pass, and was initially cognitive psychology. So there was a lot of about the theory of learning as well, and so on and so forth, which was also really helpful, because obviously how we learn as singers and performers in general is a massive subject on its own as well. And the therapy angle came into it a tiny bit later. So I'm the eternal or perpetual learner. So it's just one of my things. I think that's where the perfectionist still comes through. I never feel like I'm done. I always need to keep on going. I always want to know more, and so on and so forth. And that's where the interest in mental health came into it, and where the therapy qualifications then basically came into play as well.
So I'm really curious now that you have gathered all of these tools and you've been in the practice. Um, I personally work with children ages 3 up through 18. That's really been my specialty area for the last over 20 years. But then, of course, go up to into adults and speakers as well. And I'm just curious, what have you found to be the most common areas that singers are challenged by, especially when it comes to this inner critic that we are talking about? And yeah, well, you tell me, what challenges do you see, and how can we best help them? What tools have you gained where you're like, if there's only one thing that you should look into, learn more about? I'm not going to limit you to one, but give us some ideas.
That would be tricky. Because it's such an individual thing. It's sort of you always need to look at the person in front of you, obviously. So there are never any hard and fast rules. And even if we work in a more therapeutic capacity, we quite frequently have to change tack, if you know what I mean. Just because we start in a certain way, it doesn't mean that's how we go on. So that wouldn't be beneficial to the client in any way. I mean, what's very common, it's exactly what you say, sort of the inner critic that I always call this, we're listening while we're performing, essentially. So it's this constant, I'm not really in the moment, essentially. And that's something that you see, especially, I mean, if we're talking about your age group, and the slightly older kids, I mean, you get it in the younger ones as well, I would assume, although the really young ones, they're not my sort of area of specialism. But you see it especially once they get to teenage, essentially, when their thinking starts to turn more into that of an adult as well, sort of where you really find that very often you're not in the moment. So you're either trying to be one step ahead, or you're thinking potentially of what might be happening if you mess up this performance or whatever. So the eye is on the future outcome, so to speak. So outcome orientation is a very big one. And then especially also in kids who are more anxious, for instance, that they have a very strong recollection of one situation that went wrong in their view, obviously, where they maybe forgot their lines or something happened, whatever it might have been in the individual case. And they carry that with them. And it becomes the blueprint, essentially. It's the thing they fear is going to fear again. And they take that into every performance, essentially. But I think that I would say is one of the biggest challenges, to help them to stay present, essentially, to not have their imagination is such a great thing, but especially if you're anxious about something, it can also start to run away with you, essentially. And I would say this is one of the things that I see quite commonly in all age groups, but especially when we're talking about your clients, especially in the teenage population, I would say.
How would you describe the value of staying in the moment?
It's paramount. It's really, really important. And I always hark back to that in literally everything I do. That's something, that's a skill you can learn like any other skill. And it can feel tricky at first. And it can also feel unsettling for certain clients. That's why it's always really, really important to, especially when we're talking about trauma-informed practice and so on and so forth, to maybe also have an eye on if there's something going on in the background that we maybe should be knowing about, or that might interfere with what we're doing in the studio, essentially. But this is really, I would say, one of the most important things that people learn to be fully present, because of course you can't course correct to a certain degree when you notice, like, I don't know, the voice is maybe straying off a tiny bit as opposed to where you want it to be, and so on and so forth. But that's a skill most of us have learned, and I don't even want to say perfected, over quite some time. So it's not something that just happens and overnight it's there. But I think a lot of the time when people are performing, they try to do it all at once. They're trying to sort of listen to what they're doing and then correcting at the same time. And as I said, they're starting to always be a step ahead, essentially. And that can be so far ahead that it interferes with really being present and really getting your message across, essentially, and just trusting the body that for your current stage of development, that it actually knows what it has to do, instead of you trying to force it into any direction and sort of control it sort of with your prefrontal cortex.
Yeah, I think that resonates so much for me because I know for myself, and I see it in a lot of my sort of go-getting students, it's like they want to just do it, and they do it in a way where I feel like they're kind of pushing to get it done, right? Like, I'm going to do this, and and I end up saying, well, we have to actually just like let go for it to happen, which seems like the opposite. It's such a bizarre, experience when you want to you have this impetus to sort of chase after something, and instead you have to like let it come. Would you say that that's kind of fits in with the way you describe it, and just really being in your body? Tell us more about that.
I think it's a bit like what you sometimes hear about relinquishing control to actually be in control. And that sounds so paradoxical, if you know what I mean, because if we try to control things and if we try to be in control, that's usually when we're losing it and when we're losing sight of what's really important. And it's what you say, sort of just letting go and trusting. I think trust is a big subject in that way. And I think when I do workshops with all sorts of singers, and also in my one-on-one work, and we very often talk about something that we call experiential avoidance, which essentially means we think sort of, when we hear avoidance, we think like, oh yeah, in the context of performance anxiety, maybe that's those people who don't go on stage anymore, or they don't want to perform or whatever. But it goes further than that, and it hasn't to be avoiding performance situations at all. Experiential avoidance is the avoidance of an experience that can also relate to a sensation in your body, a certain way of thinking or whatever. So this idea that whatever happens in the moment is not good enough, is not right, and I don't want to experience it, and I'm resisting it. And this is a very, very big one, especially in nervous performers, because performance anxiety or even just performance nerves obviously come with uncomfortable physical sensations. So the sweaty hands, the racing heart, the shaking legs, whatever that is individually. And people are desperate to get rid of these physical symptoms. So in the moment, they're trying to do something to avoid the physical sensation because they don't like it and because they feel it interferes with giving their best. And coincidentally, that's what switches on the big torchlight, so to speak, and puts the focus on it. So the moment I'm starting to resist it, I'm actually making it bigger and I'm giving it more attention. And it turns into the self-fulfilling prophecy when the very thing we don't want starts to take over, essentially. And that's a big part of all sorts of therapeutic approaches, essentially, that we learn to have what we call affect and sensation tolerance, so that we know these sensations are there, and that we're okay with them being there, and that we're not resisting them, and that we gradually build tolerance towards them. And coincidentally, when we're making peace with them that way, that's when they tend to fall away without making an effort and without having to use hacks and having a big performance routine or a big pre-performance routine, or doing little things even during the performance, and so on and so forth. So I think this is a really, really big topic, getting out of this avoidance trap. Let's just call it that.
So I'm hearing what you're saying, and I'm hearing you say, especially if I go to translate it into language for younger singers that I work with, that basically first we want to perhaps name what we're feeling, really become in touch with it, name it, feel it, and get used to knowing that this is going to happen, right? This is likely to happen because it's coming up for you, and that's okay. And now that we know it's coming, it's like, I don't know, having a party, that some people you might be really excited to come in. Some people maybe you're not as excited about, but you're going to make peace with that and make peace with these feelings. And then you can actually focus on what the point is of the party or what the point is of the performance, right? And I'm imagining, I was listening to you, you speak, Petra just spoke at the singing conference that was addressing singers in midlife. And actually you were talking about peak performance and flow. And what I was gathering is that really it's about being in flow, your peak state, where maybe the more you're able to just focus on why you're doing this and what you love about it, that's going to be a guiding light. Is that accurate? Tell us your take on it.
Exactly. So because you're not going to be in flow if you're not in the moment. You're less likely to experience flow if if you listen to it. It's sort of this idea about all these external things going on, extrinsic rewards, whatever they might be. If they become a main focus, that's also problematic. So it's really sort of doing the performance for performance's sake, essentially. So no strings attached. That's it. That's the only purpose. That's why you're there. And this is something, of course, we all can struggle with to a certain degree. With older or professional track singers, obviously, it does become about earning money with it at some point, and that's very hard to remove that, because at the end of the day, it's your livelihood. Then also for the younger singers, of course, everyone wants to be liked and everyone wants to do a good job. So there is a certain view on an outcome to a degree, but if it becomes the sole focus, that's when it gets really problematic. And I always use this sort of like little metaphor also, especially when I work with younger age groups, because I found that quite interesting because you mentioned the party there. Um, just imagine sort of like you're organizing a party essentially. And there's this one classmate, friend, whatever, friend in big quotation marks, where you're going like, oh, I really don't want them to be there. And for some reason, they appear on your doorstep because someone else brought them along or something like that. And I mean, you have a choice. You have a choice to let that ruin your party, essentially, because you're constantly focusing on that person that you don't like being there, essentially. And that's where your whole focus goes. Or you can say, you know what? I don't have to like that person. I don't need to like the idea that they're here, but I'm keeping my focus on what matters, all the other people in the room that whose company I enjoy, and so on and so forth. And who knows, if I don't sort of have my focus on, oh, they're probably going to start nagging or they're going to do something silly and it's going to ruin my day or whatever, maybe I'm actually even ending up enjoying that they're there, essentially. And I think this is a really sort of almost easy metaphor or analogy of what happens when we sort of more invite these uncomfortable feelings in instead of resisting in. That still doesn't mean we have to like how they feel or what they're like, but we also don't have to resist them. We can just let them be there and keep our eye on what matters. And that's obviously a process, so that can be hard at the start. So it would be lying to say, okay, intellectually on an abstract level, you're getting that, and that's all your problem solved, if you know what I mean. We all know that's not how it works. But there are definitely strategies and tools that can help to get our singers there, step by step, little by little, essentially, one step at a time.
And it makes me wonder if compassion is part of the solution there, in that recognizing that, the person that you don't necessarily want to be at the party, if a tool is to really put yourself in the frame of mind of, perhaps this is the only party this person ever gets to go to, or maybe this person has challenges that I just don't know about, and maybe that's why they act this way, or, but just trying to find some reasons to be compassionate towards them, and then also towards yourself when you are losing it. Does that come up for you?
Yes, it's exactly that. When you turn it around to the performance situation or the studio situation, it's the self-compassion, because that emotion that you don't want around, that feeling that you don't want around, is obviously there for a reason. There's usually a history attached to that. And that doesn't mean that we always have to dig that history up and that we have to go into the past and why and so on and so forth. And sometimes that can make sense. Sometimes you don't have to go there at all. But it's the self-compassion to know, like, okay, at the end of the day, my body and my mind probably do this because for some reason they think it's protecting me. And to sort of turn it around that way can be massively helpful, to sort of just, as I said, have self-compassion. Know that nothing that happens doesn't happen for a certain reason, and that you probably had a reason at some point to feel that way, and that this uninvited guest now just comes along maybe when you didn't plan for them to come along, essentially. But still, you can reframe your thinking around these things. And if that's something that doesn't work for you, you can also go into the body first, if you know what I mean. That's why I always say you need to look at the individual, obviously, what they respond to best. Some people are really great with metaphors and reframing their thinking and so on and so forth, and other people, for them that doesn't work at all, and it can actually make matters worse sometimes, and for them they actually benefits from going or working with the body first before they even start thinking about their thinking, so to speak.
I mean, there's so much here. We could talk forever, and I love it all. It's just so fascinating. Each thing could be its own book, just lifelong journey. But maybe tell us a little bit about this idea of being trauma informed as a teacher. Like, what does that mean? I feel like this is a relatively newer term. It certainly didn't exist when I started my singing lessons. So tell us about that.
I mean, at the end of the day, trauma informed is already sort of like almost the end goal that you have when you really also want to work with people who maybe have experienced trauma, and you want to help them with their challenges a tiny bit more, essentially. And you may be already starting to look into trauma resolution work to a certain degree as well. What is probably enough for most teachers is just trauma awareness, essentially, or maybe being a trauma sensitive teacher, as we call it, so that you actually understand and know what trauma is. Now, there will probably be people in your studio who have a trauma background. So while not everyone does, and this is something that I sometimes also, when I look at the social media landscape in general at the moment, it's also become a bit of a buzzword, if you know what I mean. Everything starts to be traumatic, and everything is trauma. And from a clinical point of view, there's a definite line between emotional discomfort or even emotional distress for a while, and trauma, if that makes any sense. But that notwithstanding, I think it's important for the teacher to actually know, out of, I don't know how many clients you have, there's a good chance that there will be people there who have a traumatic past to one degree or another. And to just basically be open to that. Also checking in on yourself. How much am I actually comfortable with? I don't want to say taking on, but with letting it close to me. I mean, people have different levels of what they're comfortable with and how much support they want to provide, and also how far in their professional development journey they want to go. And then also to know that without even having to break the subject in your studio. So you don't need to go like, okay, I have my intake form here. Do you have PTSD, or do you have a traumatic past, or whatever? So this is not what we're talking about at all. That would actually be quite intrusive, to be totally honest. But rather to know that there's certain things that might be triggering to people with a trauma background, and just to educate yourself on what they might be and how you can work slightly differently in your studio to make these people feel at ease and welcome without potentially ever having to break the subject, if that makes any sense. So this is really what being truly trauma aware or trauma sensitive, or one step further, trauma informed, is about. So it's not necessarily about okay, I all of a sudden have to be my student's counselor or my student's therapist or something. That's exactly what it not is. Trauma awareness and trauma, or being trauma informed, is actually about knowing boundaries and about knowing scope of practice and knowing when to refer, when maybe someone else needs to get involved, be that the school counselor or that you talk to the parents or whatever it might be individually, but that you know where those boundaries are, and that you also know what maybe things, I often say, the things we take for granted in our studios, that they can be quite distressing for someone with a traumatic background, so that we just generally exercise a bit more care in the way we work with people and in the way we work in our studios.
So I'm hearing you talk a lot about, awareness and the importance of boundaries, both for your students and for yourself as a teacher, knowing what you can take on. I'll just share that, having taught in New York City for the last over 20 years, working with children, I think without this language, definitely took on my own boundaries, but also awareness in that, this is such a diverse population that I've worked with, that it taught me, and I appreciate that it taught me to really assume nothing as best I can,
Yeah.
which sounds simple and is is a constant practice. So
Mhm.
for me, that looks like, I assume nothing. Um, Sort of big cases that stand out are, my student may or may not have a home. Homelessness is a big thing here. Food insecurity is something, right? The loss of a parent, especially with 9/11. I taught some children who had lost a parent, and I was very grateful that in those cases, people did let me know ahead of time that that was the case. And it never came up. It never came up in my teaching. I never talked about it with them. Of course, I was there ready should they want to share something, but I was grateful to have that awareness. So I'm imagining that that's an example of what you're talking about. And it's the only question that I do have on my intake form. I only recently added it for families to just share, if they're willing, of course, but that it's helpful for us to just know if there has been a loss, someone in the family, because it's especially working with small children. Developmentally, there are different ages where it comes up in different ways, and we just want to be supportive. And I feel like with singing, we haven't even gone into the act of singing really. We've been in all of our talk here today, which is kind of ironic. But a quick question, which is deep and we could go on forever with, is, personally, I find that singing is therapeutic. And it's by the
Yeah.
nature of singing. If you're just singing for singing, which is what I'm really hoping to have first, above dreams of performing, which is wonderful too, if that's your dream, but that you're really singing from your heart, that you're singing what the songs that you want to sing, that it's this, especially for young children, this sort of unconscious way of releasing emotion of
Yeah.
whatever it is. So that, families where maybe the child is going through it, parents are getting divorced or they're celebrating something, it doesn't matter, but that their song choice and how they're singing and the actual unleashing of their voice, releasing the tension and opening it up, that there's something, it seems to me, that just humanity sings, and that when we open ourselves to it and get into our bodies, like you're talking about, that it is its own type of therapy. How does that ring true for you? This is
I
my own theory.
Yes. And I think, I mean, we probably all had that student before, if you know what I mean, where sort of things were falling into place for them, whatever, and they were getting frustrated or something. And all of a sudden, you have one session and they start crying out of nowhere. And it's this massive emotional release. And it's like a massive knot has untied itself out of nowhere, if you know what I mean. But that happens through music. That happens through the voice, essentially. That's why I always say, why I find it so important as well that students have some influence on what they're actually singing, because I feel deep down we know what we want to do, we know where we want to go, we know what would be helpful for us. And sometimes if the musical diet is like very prescribed in a way, there's often no space for that. So I always think there has to be space for that as well, that people can make their own choices. I mean, of course, we're there to advise and from a technical point of view to say, okay, maybe this is something where we're sort of going to look into that, but we maybe do a couple of little tweaks here and there and so on and so forth. But I think it's really, really important that students literally have a voice in that as well. And it opens all emotional channels. It is therapeutic, definitely.
Well, thank you for validating that. And I certainly, yeah, I mean, crying in a voice lesson, I feel like sometimes I have to tell my friends who are in the outside, the muggles who are not in the music world, like, if you're going to try a voice, just know that that does happen. Like things come up that you don't associate with it. Just, I'm going to take a class in music. Like it gets really deep. So, and
Yeah.
in a really great way, if you allow it and if you want it to.
So that we're creating that safe space where the yeah, the student doesn't feel or doesn't have to feel embarrassed when that's happening as well. So that it's really okay if that happens, or even if they get frustrated or angry as well, that it's okay to have these emotions in the studio. And I think that's just what it is.
Oh, and I love that point about getting angry and frustrated because obviously that's something that comes up a lot. It's so that's great. And that's a great working and practice ground, of how to deal with those emotions in life, right? When just dealing with it in a song. I think this is a good segue to get into my Brene Brown inspired question of your mini playlist. So I asked Petra to put together a list of 5 songs or pieces that she really loves. She gave us this list: The Parting Glass with
Mhm.
Hosier, performed a great live version, yes. Evanescence, My Immortal. Hans Zimmer, Time. Sleeping at Last, I'll Keep You Safe, and Max Richter on the Nature of Daylight. What would you say that these songs, this little playlist, says about you?
Yeah, I found that really hard because there's so much music I love, and to sort of narrow it down to 5, I found that really, really tricky. But the reason why I choose those ones, I think they encapsulate, in a way, my own musical journey. They encapsulate the areas I work in as well. For instance, I have a background, I always loved folk music essentially. So I played the fiddle and sang at the same time. And then obviously moving to Scotland sort of gave that a whole new life as well. And many of my students who I teach at the University of the Highlands and Islands are traditional or folk musicians. And so The Parting Glass is definitely, an homage to that essentially. So the Scottish and the Irish still fight very hard about whether it's a Scottish or an Irish song. It is actually a Scottish song, but and I think it was a parting song long before Old Lang Syne essentially took over as the parting song. But so that was that. But it's also about my own history, I think, in a way, musically. So as I said, there's a folk background, then the sort of more musical theater and pop background. So you might find it surprising that there's not a single musical theater song in my top 5. But as I said, I found that really, really hard. And My Immortal, for instance, is in there because I just used to love that song. When I was younger, shall I say that? But it also has a very, very special place in my heart. It's quite interesting because we just talked about that there about emotional release and so on and so forth. Because this was a song I actually couldn't sing for a long time after my mom had passed away. And then I consciously chose to keep on singing it essentially till all floodgates opened. And I felt like this was the release I needed, which sounds really strange, but it really helped in that way. And then I even took it to the studio and recorded it afterwards. So that ties into that sort of more psychological aspect for me as well. And then some of the more instrumental songs are a lot about where I'm now. That I sometimes feel like that music or words can often get into the way for me. And I really like listening to instrumental music, especially film music as well. So that's why those songs are in there. And they also have a link to parenthood for me because they're all quite specific in that way, and what it meant to me to become a mother and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of that in there for me as well. So I found that a hard selection to make, but they're sort of, all these songs are me musically, where I am right now, where my roots are, but they also have a lot to do with me as a person, and some of the tougher times I went through, but also some of the really joyous times. And I think that's what music and singing ultimately is about, that it's your constant companion. And no matter where you are in life, that there's always a song for it, essentially.
Oh, I'm teary-eyed and so grateful and moved that you would share so much of yourself with us today. It's really beautiful and inspiring. And my hope and wish is that this will really help inspire others, to continue singing, to continue teaching, to open themselves up to the gifts that music and singing have to bring, and diving into these emotions that are uncomfortable and sticky and awkward and painful, and coming through them in a way where you gain more strength and can kind of come back into the world and give more. So it's just really inspiring that you've been an example of that. And I'm so grateful to you and all the work that you've done. I want to, well, before I go into the rapid fire question round, I have to ask about Google because that is so cool. As a big Google fan, I have to know, give us a little snippet of like, how did this happen? What did you do for your work with Google?
Well, that came to pass completely by accident because someone else who was working with them essentially just felt it was a bit out of their wheelhouse, what specific people needed essentially, and I guess that's where word of mouth comes in, and they recommended me, and I've never looked back since, and I basically just help people to sort of it's not just about speaking as such, if you know what I mean. So these are sort of more when you're feeling nervous about speaking, when you feel like you can't give your best when you're giving a presentation, and so on and so forth. And I think it's a really great thing that support is there as well, essentially, because whether we sing or we speak, we're using our voices, and from a performance point of view and from the nerves that are involved, it's not really all that different. And it's great. It's great work.
Oh, that's fantastic. And it definitely plugs into, my own personal interests of my methodology of how to teach voice, and that it's applies to singing and to speaking because of course it's all the same mechanism. So really about being able to give your best and be your best. So, oh, that's incredible work. Very exciting and inspiring. Okay, the rapid fire questions,
Let's
just
hear
one word answer,
it.
whatever comes to mind. There's no wrong answer. Just put it out there. Okay. And I know that these are tricky, but that's also what kind of makes it fun. Just, what comes to mind. Ready? So, singing is blank.
Singing is, well, basically allowing your voice to be heard, and also saying or singing what often can't be said in another way.
Teaching is blank.
Not my preferred mode of operation. I see myself more as a coach. I sort of have a very tricky relationship with the word teaching, but I think that's just me.
I have to ask, that's really interesting because, yeah, tell us what teaching means to you and why. What's the difference for you? Because that's a whole thing here, voice teacher versus voice coach, but what's it mean for you?
I mean, I know that sort of there's a clear line, especially in the States. I think it's not quite so, tricky here, essentially, between voice coach or vocal coach and singing teacher. But if I just look at the word teaching or teacher, it always, for me, at least for a very long time, has implied this, one-way transfer of information. That there's one person giving you the information and you're taking it. And for me, although one could argue when you're teaching singing, obviously, if you want to stick with those, terminologies that people are more comfortable around. And I know that vocal coach means something very different to some people. But I think coaching as such is a much more collaborative process for me, sort of where it's not a one-way street, where there's give and take and where there's back and forth, and you're constantly sort of drawing a new line, and it's fluid and it shifts. So it's not just, as I said, this one-way transfer of information.
Oh, I totally get it. And actually, I might have to rephrase that question because of that. One of my mentors, Eric Booth, who is sort of famous for being the father of teaching artist in that term, he took the time to tell us that the definition of educate is actually to draw out. And so that is actually how I label my team as voice educators, because I love the idea of drawing out, which I think is what you're saying, that idea of collaborating and coaching, and you're working with someone rather than just the one way. Oof, I might have to redo that after you now. Question number 2. Always revising. I love it. Always learning. Okay. Okay, question 3. You're nervous walking on stage. What's the first thing you do?
For me, if I felt it was very acute, I usually try to switch sensory channels. I'm very, for me, that's why I never had problems singing in front of a big anonymous mass, if you know what I mean. I am fine singing in front of 1,000 people that I can't see. But if I have an audience that's very close and I can see the faces, I'm like, oh. So, and for me, it's sort of disengaging the vision in that case, so that I'm not starting to scan sort of facial expressions, because that's when the mind starts to run away with me. Sort of when I think like someone just has a certain facial expression, but I think, oh God, they're looking bored. Oh no, they're thinking this is horrible, that type of thing. So that I'm actually taking that stimulus away, essentially. And I think that works in other cases as well, sort of just switch the channel that sort of makes you feel uneasy, essentially. So if you have a very, very strong sensation of something is going on in my body that feels uncomfortable, then engage your vision or engage your hearing or whatever it might be.
Change the channel. I love it. Okay.
Change the channel.
You're home alone. What piece do you love to perform when no one's listening, and why?
That's a really tricky one. I think I would go back to what I said earlier about, sometimes I find that the lyrics get into the way of truly emoting for me. And an artist I greatly admire is Lisa Gerard, who uses a lot of, she just sings on randomly generated sounds that just come to her in the moment. So it's a type of improvisation, I guess, but she never uses words that have, or not never, but in many of her songs, she doesn't use words that hold any meaning to us. So I would probably choose one of her songs.
Beautiful. What's an example of something ordinary you find extraordinary and that you're grateful for?
I would say, winding down at night with my daughter, sort of like bedtime stories and snuggling up and so on. And I think there's something very, very, ordinary, but also extraordinary about that moment just when they're falling asleep. That might sound really strange now, but I think that's something for me that gets me into that space where I feel like, how lucky am I? And how peaceful and great is this?
Oh, I love that moment. That's so.
Don't we all, if we're mothers?
Oh, I have to ask, how old is your daughter?
She's 7 now,
Oh,
but she's still it's still every night you're just, stories and whatever. It's still totally there. And I don't mind it. I actually quite like it.
oh,
It's a peaceful place, if you know what I mean, where everything else switches off. So I quite enjoy it.
okay. Final question. We are celebrating you. The sky's the limit. How would you want to celebrate?
That ties in quite nicely with me being a textbook introvert. So
Are we celebrating in a library?
Celebrations. No, I think it would be something smaller group, not too many people, and probably, don't know, there's something really nice and pleasing about being at the water for me, being at the ocean. So maybe a small gathering at a beach somewhere, sunshine, good food, close group of friends, that type of thing. That would be a celebration for me.
Oh, I love it. Love it. Oh, that's great. Well, we are celebrating you today. I'm so thrilled that you were here. You're so generous with your time. I'm really grateful for you sharing your expertise with us. And I just want to ask you, where can teachers find you? And, where not just teachers, but anyone looking for peak performance skills and really how to use their voice, where should they be looking for you?
Well, I have a web page which is called singingsense.com. So I'm quite sure that can be found somewhere. And yeah, people can find out everything about me and what I'm doing on that page. So it's both about the coaching and the therapeutic work, but also about the teacher education I'm doing sort of in mental health essentially. So I just brought out a self-study course there, and I also do consultations for teachers. So maybe just want the studios to be more mental health aware or more trauma aware, and who have a lot of questions and don't want to be the counselor or therapist for their clients to sort of how to go on about that. So these are my two main lines of work these days, and everything you need to know about those can be found on my page.
Fantastic. And I just want to make sure that everyone's aware that Petra just came out with a self-study course. It sounds fabulous. I cannot wait to check it out. It's entitled Mental Health in the Performing Arts, and it's been specifically designed to help teachers stay boundaried while at the same time becoming more trauma and mental health aware, like we were speaking about. And it contains modules specifically aimed to provide support for performers with music performance anxiety, and a module about safe coaching strategies in the studio based on an acceptance and commitment approach. So you can find that at singingsense.com. And again, just a tremendous, huge hug, virtual hug, and thank you for spending all this time with us today. It was just such an honor.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
All right, take care. Thank you for joining me for this podcast. To learn more about my step-by-step approach to voice education, where I've consolidated 30 years of vocal study into 4 words even a 3-year-old can do, just go to www.vielka.com. That's Vielka.com. Happy singing.